Welcome friends, welcome to this series on the English essay. I am Professor Payal Nagpal and today we will be discussing Samuel Johnson's The Idler. In this series, we've already discussed essays in The Rambler, we've discussed The Spectator, The Tatler. Today we will be discussing The Idler. As you can make out, the title itself is very interesting. But and before we actually discuss what really speaking the idler carried and what really speaking is the meaning that Johnson and the others wanted to convey through the term idler, let us pause and go back to the definition of what we really mean by an essay. So, if we look at, and this is straight from Samuel Johnson's dictionary, where he defines the essay as, in three different ways. One, an attempt, an endeavor. Then the second one is, which is most commonly known, by all of us, that the essay is a loose sally of the mind, an irregular, indigested piece, not a regular and orderly composition. And the third is a trial and experiment. In fact, qualifies it further, first taste of anything, first experiment. Now, this is very interesting because if we look at these different nuances that have been given to the essay in terms of the dictionary meaning that was devised by Samuel Johnson, I think the essay carries, interestingly, a structure that is very flexible. Now, where in form, of course, the essay remains what it is, but in terms of its content, there is a certain malleability, there is a flexibility, there is an amorphous nature that makes the essay, into a category, into a structure to which everyone can respond, in which everyone can participate in a certain way. Because if we look at the first definition itself, it is an attempt. And then it is a loose sally of the mind, irregular, indigested piece, which means that there are thoughts that come to one's mind, and these thoughts can be expressed in a proper literary form, and this literary form is that of the essay. This brings us to another qualifier, that this is like a trial, it's an experiment. Now, because we are looking at this in terms of a certain malleability, a certain flexibility, so each essay is going to be in a sense different from the next one. And so this kind of very experimental notion that we have of the essay becomes important for us to understand the idler. Now, when we say the experimental notion, it's important to keep in mind that usually in our day-to-day lives, we don't think of the essay in this particular manner. But when we go back, especially to the 18th century, where the writing of the essay, really speaking, becomes it prospers, becomes dynamic, and is associated with, of course, the whole coffee house culture, the rise of the middle class, and the making, in a sense, of the bourgeoisie. So, with the making of a new social group, we are also looking at the making of these new categories, and that is where the essay should be pitched. If we look at the idler, the time period exactly in which it's written, it's not very long. These are just about 103 essays published in the London Weekly, and this was the Universal Chronicle. This was between 1758 and 1760. So, apart from Samuel Johnson, who interestingly contributed only about 12 to the idler, we also had Thomas Wharton, Bennet Langton, and Joshua Reynolds. They all wrote for it. And so, it's very commonly believed that the essays in the idler were written with so-called less seriousness as compared to the essays in the Rambler. But if we actually look at some of these essays, they of course give us a very good idea of the social spectrum, but some of these essays are very hard hitting, and at the same time there are other essays that make us think about the 18th century and the changes that set in the society in the 18th century. Now, to quote O'Flaherty here, Boswell says that many number of the Idler were written as hastily as an ordinary letter. So this literally brings in the definition loose sally of the mind, that you just kind of pick up a piece of paper and you just start writing what comes to your mind, and that at least one was composed in less than half an hour. So I think this is where the definition and the writing of the essay, the two kind of gel with each other. It is also clear that in the collected editions, Johnson did not revise the Idler as extensively as he did the Rambler. So, but the Rambler was earlier. But it appears that Johnson kind of was invested more, in the Rambler with a certain seriousness than the Idler. However, this is only, a perception, because it's also important to actually look at the essays for what they are. So, to continue with O'Flaherty, and that whereas he once praised his earlier periodical as pure wine, he described the Idler as a series of trifles. Now, even though he describes them as a series of trifles, the essays in the Idler give us a very good insight, as I said, into the society of the time. So, the reader of the essay, the critic, should probably also evolve an opinion based on the essays in front, and that's a point that is stressed by O'Flaherty as well. So, if we look at this, we realize that the essay is significant for the category to which it belongs, that of the essay, so in terms of structure, and then thematically there are a series of themes that are covered. If one were to qualify them, in terms of broad categories, one can say reflections on life, one can talk about reflections on literary categories and literature itself, and of course reflections on social characters. So, for example, there is a merchant, there is a lady's maid, and there's a hoarder wife. So, there are a whole lot of characters that we see here. Whereas in the Rambler, this especially this creation of a persona is not really speaking as sharp as it is in the Idler, and the essays in the Idler are precious for this reason. So, if we in general, the gaze is turned inward upon the hidden reservoir, of hopes and vanities and so on. So, in the Idler, there is a deliberate attempt to alter, in a sense, the kind of perspective that has been evolved, in the Rambler. And one can see that, to again go back to O'Flaherty, Johnson tries to distance himself from the reader and from society by adopting and attempting to sustain a mask of whimsical, cynical idleness. So, I think these two words are very important here, that we are looking at a whimsical and a cynical idleness, which means that idleness is a persona, a mask, a position that Johnson adopts to comment on what he sees around in the mid 18th century. In fact, this belongs to the last decade of the 1750s. So, it was a curious pose for him to adopt for his own habitual indolence, made him aware of the evils of idleness, and the Rambler contains many warnings against laziness and exhortations to labor. So how do we resolve this contradiction about an essayist who's critical of laziness and indolence in the Rambler and also in the Idler, but yet at the same time he adopts this as a position. So this is, as O'Flaherty rightly says, a curious pose for him, and he continues that it is not surprising that even in the Idler he is unable to maintain the pose consistently, because Johnson is critical of it. Yet the term Idler is of great value here. Nevertheless, the mask is put on, and when one looks at Johnson's other writings, one realizes that the term detachment is important here. And this detachment allows the writer of the essay to become an observer and to look around him with a very objective eye. So, this objective perspective, this idea of detachment that O'Flaherty talks about, is a central aspect of the idler and is important because it creates that distance between the writer and the society and allows the essayist to observe everything very carefully. Now, how does he observe? Because the 18th century is known for wit, for satire. So, the use of humor, irony, observation of character, all these aspects become important in the writing of essays for the idler. And as of course the critic has rightly said, that this is really speaking the stance of a satirist. So, he, the essay and the essays in the idler squarely belong to the 18th century, where this is very, very important. So, let us look at the first essay itself, in which the character of the idler is defined. Like, who is this idler is the question that is being posed here, and Johnson is answering the question of who is the idler. So, he says, and to quote from essay number 1, which is the title that is given is The Idler's Character. Every man is or hopes to be an idler. Every man is or hopes to be an idler. Even those who seem to differ most from us are hastening to increase our fraternity. As peace is the end of war, so to be idle is the ultimate purpose of the busy. So, there is also a very subtle, if one may read into this, a critique of the busy. Several characters, especially from the bourgeoisie, are depicted in this particular series, where they are busy moving from one task to the next, but the ultimate purpose is peace, and peace is the end of war, which means to be idle is the ultimate purpose of the busy. Now, it's not as if Johnson is praising the idler, but Johnson is kind of delineating very clearly what the position of the idler here is, because to be idle means what? To that there is nothing to do. And soon enough, if we really look at the 19th century, particularly the middle class establishing itself, productivity, labor, all these will soon become very important terms, and labor and work will acquire an entirely new meaning. But there is a group of people that is abuzz, and suddenly the question that Johnson is posing is, what does it mean to be an idler? So, in the essays, there is satire, there is humor, there is almost like an anecdotal telling, but there is a comment on the genre itself. So, he says that man may be more properly distinguished as an idle animal, for there is no man who is not sometimes idle. It is at least a definition from which none that shall find it in this paper can be accepted, for who can be more idle than the reader of the idler? So it's interesting here, he is at his wittiest best when he says this, that it's not just the writer of the idler, but also the reader. So, which tells us that there is time to invest, to write the essay, and at the same time there is a reading public. There is a reader out there who is going to read this particular series of essays titled The Idler. So, he says that the definition may be complete. Idleness, he says, is not just general, but it's a peculiar characteristic. And man, he says, is the only one who can be called idle that does by others what he might do himself, or sacrifices duty or pleasure to the love of ease. And these, are very prescient in the sense that, one really needs to connect this with the sea change that is going to set in pretty much towards the end of the century and the beginning of the 19th. And so, the idler is not a man who is revered. The idler does not have rivals, because there are people who want to always show themselves to be busy, and here is the idler. So, the man of business forgets him, The man of enterprise despises him, and those such as tread the same track of life fall commonly into jealousy and discord, idlers are always found to associate in peace. Now, this is where the mask of the idler becomes very, very important, because it is indeed a position that is taken to talk about a lot of the other things. So, and he who is most famed for doing nothing is glad to meet another as idle as himself. So, the idler, he says, is always inquisitive because he has the time to look around, he has the time to observe things around him, and there is wit, there is humor, there is satire. So, the idler is naturally censorious, he says, right. So for him to be naturally censorious means that the idler is looking around at everything, not just with an observant eye, but also with a very, very critical eye. So those who attempt nothing think everything else easily performed, and so he says, what is really speaking to be expected from the idler? What is the reader's expectation going to be from this? So, he already preempts a lot of questions and answers those in the very first issue of the idler. So, he writes, the idler has some scheme, that cannot be doubted, because to form schemes is the idler's privilege. But though he has many projects in his head, he is now grown sparing of communication, having observed that his hearers are apt to remember what he forgets himself. And so he says, I think it necessary to give notice that I make no contract nor incur any obligation. So he says that don't expect anything very concrete. There is no contract here, and there is no obligation, there is no patronage, right? So if those who depend on the idler for intelligence and entertainment should suffer the disappointment which commonly follows ill-paced expectations, they are to lay the blame only on themselves. So he has done something very interesting. He's given a lot of power to the figure of the idler, who's going to look around and is going to talk about whatever he sees and whatever he thinks needs to be critically looked at and discussed. But at the same time, he has put the reader squarely at a distance when he says that if you're expecting the idler to be very intelligent and you're also expecting entertainment, then if you're disappointed with what you read, then the blame lies on you and not on the idler. So he says that of course you can't really cast away all hope. The idler, though sluggish, is yet alive and may sometimes be stimulated to vigor and activity. He may descend into profoundness or tower into sublimity, but these, he says, exertions, he calls them exertions of intellect, cannot be frequent. So what he says is that when you read the essays in the idler, you might see a bright streak somewhere, but that cannot be the norm. What is the function of this particular position? Why is he doing this? So it's interesting that today at least it would appear that one of the advantages of this is the scope of the idler becomes vast. So the idler is free to write whatever he wants, and of course some of the essays were written in the form of they were addressed to the idler and written by different characters. For example, Betty Broom. So Betty Broom's history, in that Betty Broom writes to the idler, and then of course Betty Broom's history continued was there, and so on. So these, he says, of course you might find a bright streak somewhere, but well, he says for this reason, he says he will therefore gladly receive help from any correspondent who should enable him to please without his own labor. And here too, if you look at the way in which some of the essays are written as being written by the characters to the idler, they are very interesting. They are written by people from different walks of course they are written by either Johnson or Joshua Reynolds and so on, but the persona that is adopted is of the different characters from society. So for example, if there is a character whose wife is writing to the idler. So, of course, the essay is being written by one of the essayists, but the persona adopted is such that it is being addressed to the idler and being written by the character. So, he excludes no style and prohibits no subject. So, you can write about anything. So, either the idler or people can write to the idler, and they can be from any rung of the society and so on. But the only condition is that the letters should not be long and words should not be squandered in declarations of esteem or confessions of inability. So, both polarity, I mean both ends of the spectrum are rejected, that don't start praising, don't start declaring esteem or confess your inability to do something. So, conscious dullness has little right to be prolix and praise is not welcome to the idler as quiet. So, anything can be said here, but the only thing is that the two extremes are to be avoided. So, anyone can write to the idler. Now, this is where the entire structure, it allows for a discussion of a wide variety of themes in the idler. So, and the tone adopted in the essays also has a very wide range, as we will soon be discussing some of these essays. This was the first one, the idler's character. We started with this, but we realize that some of the essays, especially the one on the vultures, is the tone is so sharp and so satirical, it clearly reminds one of the very famous essay published, which was a short view of the state of Ireland, published by Swift in 1728. So, this was really speaking very important, and if we actually discuss this particular essay, here is a vulture speaking to a young one as heard by a shepherd who understands the language of the birds. So, there is a human being who understands the language of the birds, and this person overhears a vulture speaking to a young one, and the young vultures ask the parent vulture that where a man may be found and how he may be known. So, the young vulture says, his flesh is surely the natural food of a vulture, and why have you never brought a man in your talons to the nest? And the mother says that, well, man is too bulky, and it's impossible. Of course, one can feed on the dead man, but it's very difficult to carry the dead person. Now, here what we have is a very, very difficult, hard-hitting and sharply satirical connection made between humans and vultures. And so, which is why as mentioned earlier, that it totally reminds us of Swift. So, my children, said the old vulture, to quote from the vulture, you will the less want my instructions because you've had my practice. And the vulture goes on to explain how the younger vultures have seen the mother snatch from the farm the household fowl. You have seen me seize the leveret in the bush, the kid in the pasture, and so on. So, in short, the young ones have seen the mother hunt for prey and capture it, and of course how the mother has fed the young ones. Now, so in talking about the human beings, the mother then tells the children that there is a kind of ferocity. She says that there is a strange ferocity which I have never observed in any other being that feeds upon the earth. Two herds of men will often meet and shake the earth with noise and fill the air with fire. When you hear noise and see fire which flashes along the ground, hasten to the place with your swiftest wing, for men are surely destroying one another. So, what is the vulture talking about here? The mother vulture is talking about war, is talking about the way in which groups of people divide themselves into two opposing sides and absolutely destroy each other. So, we have already looked at a very, very wide range. If we look at the tone of the first essay itself, the idler's character, and we then move on to number 22, which is the vulture, we realize that the variation is very, very vast. So, and to discuss something like war, the persona of the vulture, it is significant that here the position of the idler becomes important, because the detachment that we discussed right at the beginning, with respect to the idler, becomes a very important, distancing here to be able to effectively and objectively look at what is happening around here. So, uh, uh, with this, I hope that everything from the definition of the essay and the way in which the idler and the term idler has significance becomes understandable, and this will give you a very good idea about the way in which we have a very vast range of tone, of themes, of character that is discussed in the essays in the idler. Thank you.